Okay, so as David mentioned, that was actually, we didn't plan our talks to synchronize, but I think they're gonna harmonize pretty well. There were some critiques of behavior genetics in the 70s and 80s that really shut down the use of genetics in economics and sociology for a long time. And so for a while, if you were thinking about a branch of the social sciences that was really actively thinking about genetics and genetic individual differences, it was psychology. So the first thing I want to do is just think about, well, why is that? Why was psychology the nexus? And then in what ways has it fallen behind? And then what I want to do, I was tempted to pull a bunch of different examples of genetic data in psychology, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow one topic from my lab, which I'm doing, one, because I'm interested in it. It's like what I'm thinking about right now. But also because it's a topic where we've thrown a lot of different methods at analyzing or trying to approach one problem. And that problem is, what are non-cognitive skills? What do we mean by that? So I'm not going to get obviously into any of the mathematical details of that, because that's why y'all are here for the next 2 weeks. What I really want to do is try to give a very 30,000 feet view up of what is the problem and what is this particular analysis, why is it kind of getting at that problem. So there might be a lot of things where you're like, I'm not totally sure what she's talking about, but like maybe it can be some scaffolding that you can hang some of the knowledge for the next 2 weeks on. Okay, so my animations were lost in the PDF conversion. So in the early 1970s, a small group of people came together to form what is now the Behavior Genetics Association. And I think if you look at who those people were, you get a lot of interesting information about the intellectual roots of using genetic data in psychology. So the first president of the Behavior Genetics Association was this guy, Theodosius Dobzhansky, which I can never spell without having to Google it. And Dobzhansky was a world famous biologist. He was famous for contributing to the modern evolutionary synthesis. So his work was, we have this work from Mendel on the transmission of hereditary elements, and we have this work from Darwin that's talking about how there's descent with modification over time. And then we have these quantitative traits that Fisher has been talking about. How do these things go together? How can we synthesize these different strands? And so he was very much concerned. I mean, his home base was definitely evolutionary biology, and he was an intellectual giant in that field. Two of the other members of that first group of behavior genetics were two psychologists, John Lowland, who was and still is at the University of Texas, where he started the Texas Adoption Project, and Irv Gottesman, who was a clinical psychologist whose dissertation in 1963 was on the heritability of personality. And I think if you think about the group of those three together, that's kind of some odd bedfellows. Like, how did these psychologists in Texas who were doing adoption studies end up in the same organization as one of the most internationally esteemed evolutionary biologists of that time? And the link between them were that both of them had colleagues doing animal studies of genetics, so experimental animal work, such as John Fuller. So the foundational text on behavior genetics is all about temperament in dogs, because that's what Fuller was obsessed with, was dog models. And those animal studies were really dominated by two paradigms. So one was cross-fostering studies, where you took dams from one rat and took them away from their mother and had them raised by another rat, or inbred mouse line studies, where you interbred relatives in order for them to be as genetically similar as possible. And that allowed you to isolate genetic and environmental variance in behavior more closely. So if we think about the intellectual origins of genetics and psychology, which is really what ultimately gave rise to genetics and the social sciences, it's really centered around a group of people that were brought together by experimental animal paradigms, crossbreeding, cross-fostering studies, and inbred mice studies. And if we think about the classic tools of behavior genetics, which are adoption studies and twin studies, we can really easily see how human behavior geneticists were looking at their animal colleagues, envying the level of experimental control they had over genes and environment, and thinking to themselves, how can we get at that similar sort of design? So instead of a cross-fostering design, you had an adoption study where someone had a biological parent but was raised by another. And instead of inbred mice, you had identical twins. So it was really trying to port some of the experimental paradigms of animal research into psychology. So in addition to those being the designs, because psychology was the, maybe the first field to be really sort of interested in the application of genetics to social science questions, the research didn't just focus on adoption and twin studies of everything. It focused on the things that were of particular concern to clinical and personality psychologists. So if you look at that literature, all of the studies are on the sorts of things that are relevant for clinical diagnosis or some sort of selection problem, like selection into the army or selection into a job. And so you have twin and adoption studies of psychopathology, of personality, and of mental abilities. And y'all are going to get a lot more information on those and how the parameters are estimated from them over the course of the next 2 weeks, I think. So when we think of the use of genetics in psychology, one, it very much centered around the idiosyncratic scientific concerns and sort of experimental paradigms that were available to people. But it was also, from the very beginning, dominated by the political ideologies of the people who were involved in bringing together genetics and psychology. There was never a time in which genetics was not politically controversial. There was never a time in which genetics was not involved in some sort of ideological battle. So this we see as early as the 1960s, when Art Jensen, an educational psychologist at Harvard, argued that you couldn't close racial gaps in scholastic achievement because IQ and achievement were heritable. Sort of immediately positioning behavior genetics as sort of in opposition to social policies of the Johnson-era civil rights movement. You had biologists who were very critical of behavior genetics, but were also heavily influenced by their own Marxism, which thought of biology as sort of inimical to this sort of class struggle perspective. So if you look at these intellectual roots, you see that these people, we didn't end up in a place where genetics and social sciences was controversial for no reason. From the very beginning, as people were trying to bring these fields together, they also had their own political and ideological concerns that have really inflected the field from the very beginning. In part because of this ideological polarization, but also in part because of what David mentioned are the some of the theoretical flaws of the early models of behavior genetics. Those models and that line of research faced a lot of backlash beginning in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So we have picked, David and I, serendipitously, the exact same two papers, Goldberger and Jinks, as these cardinal critiques of behavior genetics. And the critiques were really centered around, one, that heritability doesn't mean that things are necessarily operating through very low-level, reductionistic, narrowly physiological processes, but the mechanisms might be social or environmental in nature. Two, that heritability doesn't imply determinism. So we could have things that are heritable and yet amenable to policy or changeable via intervention. And then also the responding to what David mentioned, to this idea that if sources of inequality are heritable, they're somehow natural or just, which was sort of implicit in many of the writings of behavior genetics in the 70s and 80s. And so Lewontin was a very pronounced critic of this and saying, by claiming that inequality is heritable, are you naturalizing it and therefore making an argument implicit or explicit that it's just, that we don't need to change it in any way? Nevertheless, so there was a large amount of backlash to integrating genetics into psychology and into the social sciences. This continued through the publication of the bell curve by Herrnstein and Murray in the 1990s. But at the same time, there was this kind of constant, steady output of twin studies, of adoption studies, and of children of twin studies for decades. And summarizing the themes of that, people can organize it in different ways. But I think that there's kind of 5 big lessons of this era of research, of genetics in psychology with a primary focus on family designs, on twin and adoption designs. Okay, so the first big lesson that emerged from this was that living together with your siblings or with your parents don't make you psychologically similar to those people. So if you're looking at the correlation between adoptive children and adoptive parents, or between adoptive siblings raised in the same home, you see that they are no more similar in terms of broad dimensions of psychology, their risk for mental illness, their intelligence, their personality, than are 2 people that are kind of randomly plucked from the population. So we're used to thinking about things in terms of between family stratification, how families differ from one another. But just residing in the same home with someone, if you're not genetically related to them, doesn't end up making you very psychologically similar to that person. I will say that it makes you socioeconomically similar. You end up similar with regards to your income, wealth, and education, and also your religious affiliation. But it doesn't make you more extroverted or more neurotic or more likely to have an anxiety disorder just by living with or being raised by someone with those things. The second, which Dave has already mentioned, is that everything is heritable. So when people first started this enterprise, there was this idea that they were going to find this camp of phenotypes that we had to worry about genetic variation for, or were influenced by genes in some way, and there was going to be this other camp that was somehow immune of genetic influence, and that did not work out in that way at all. So any phenotype that you look at, if you look at it in biological relatives, the more closely related they are, the more similar they are for that phenotype. And that's true for almost everything that at least psychologists care about, but I would say most human individual differences, unless they're really, really rare, that's true. As a result of that, one implication of that is that genes are this difficult to measure but non-ignorable and ubiquitous source of heterogeneity in people. That heritability seems to increase as people go through the development. At least in psychology, this seems to be counter to many people's intuitions. I know a lot of people who work with babies where they assume that the effects of your biology or the effects of your genetics are going to be biggest when you're first born, and then your experience is going to sort of accumulate on top of that and sort of bury the effect of genetic variation. In fact, what we see from twin and adoption studies is the exact opposite, that people who are genetically dissimilar become more dissimilar in their phenotypes as they grow older. People who are more genetically similar, like identical twins, grow together over time. They become more similar as they age. This, in part, might be due to the sort of jinx-esque processes of people actively selecting their own environments. So to go back to the body weight example, it could be that you have a genetic predisposition for heaviness, but that's mediated through your diet. As you get older, you have more and more latitude over what you're eating. When you go off to college, you pick your own meals, you shop for your own groceries, rather than eating what your parents put in front of you or what they cook for you. And that increasing latitude to pick your own environment might actually give your genotype more opportunity to express itself in terms of some downstream phenotypes, such as body weight. Number 4, genetic correlations between things that social scientists care about are the rule and they're not the exception. So a basic twin study is looking at what's the correlation between identical twins versus fraternal twins. But we can measure lots of things about the same set of twins, right? And then we have information about Well, how does my identical twin's height correlate with my body weight? How does my identical twin's education correlate with my risk for schizophrenia? And that can be used to estimate a genetic correlation, which is to what extent are the same genes influencing two phenotypes rather than just one. And as people started to move into more multivariate, measuring multiple things about biological relatives, they realized that these genetic correlations were ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And so the extent to which the relationships between things can be assumed to be free of common genetic influences, that's a very hard assumption to make in light of that knowledge. And then finally, Jinx is right about people creating their own environments. And most social and physical environments come to be correlated with your genotype, particularly as your age, but even in early childhood. So we see this, again, if you're looking at twin studies, if you look at more similar genetic people are treated more similarly. They choose more similar friend groups. They live in more similar neighborhoods. So one of our previous studies in my group looked at, for instance, fraternal twins who differed in very early verbal abilities, and then saw to what extent those early differences predicted the extent to which their mothers, 2 years later, behaved with them in a cognitive stimulating way. So played with them in developmentally appropriate ways, talked to them in ways that elicit language back. And what you see is that cognitive stimulation by moms predicts subsequent ability, but early ability predicts subsequent cognitive stimulation for moms. We also see that with things like antisocial behavior problems. So kids who are rowdy and hyperactive and difficult to parent end up eliciting from their parents more coercive, more harsh, more impatient parenting because they're harder to parent. So even when we're talking about children, even early in life, people are creating their own environments, they're evoking social responses from other people, and that is not random, that's systematic. So as a result, most environments cannot be assumed to be exogenous to a person's genotype. From birth, essentially, they are creating their own environment. Yes?
I get where you would say many social and physical environments. What's the
most?
Most, like the majority. Like I don't even know what the relative.
I wouldn't read. I don't know. I don't think we have to have like a Talmudic parsing of many versus most. Maybe this is. Typically, in psychology at least, we're interested in variation, like what differs between people. And so when we're talking about social and physical environments that vary within the populations we're observing, it's hard to come up with examples of things that are truly exogenous shocks. That might be somewhat influenced by my focus on sort of child psychology, parenting, social relationships. Yeah.
So would you say like most relevant social?
Yeah. So most of the ones. So like anything, we're looking at. If we're looking at any population, the thing that's constant between all of them, we don't have any purchase on understanding how does that affect you, right? Like how does living in Texas affect the twins in the Texas Twin Project? Like we don't know because they're all from Texas. So to the extent that we're looking at something that varies meaningfully or varies appreciably in the population that we're looking at, I would say that like phenotypes that vary, environments that vary tend to be related to the genotype of people. Yeah?
So I was actually related to a question about how the genetic differences change as people get older.
Yeah.
Also to what you were mentioning earlier about the differential parenting strategies, because you can imagine extending that in time and saying that the difference in behavior towards children when they become adults could also be reflected as the difference in the way society treats them, right? So sort of the social environment that responds to some sort of inherent kind of predisposition.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an extension of sort of the familial surroundings. So what I was sort of curious about was when you have things like that, how much does within that given society defining a particular phenotype, right? So the definition of mental illness or the definition of cognitive phenotypes, that becomes important.
Yes, I think.
And it becomes charged as well, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, so just going back to a very basic statement that David made earlier about how heritability estimates are population specific. There's lots of reasons for that, and part of that is just the extent to which environments or genotypes vary within any given sample or population is variable, and heritability is a fraction. But if we are thinking about these sort of transactional processes of a child has a phenotype that elicits a response from the social environment that then reinforces that phenotype, anything that dials up or dials down that transactional process is going to affect the extent to which the genotype-phenotype relationship is also dialed up or dialed down. So when we're talking about heritability being population specific, there's this extent to which there are these reinforcing environmental feedback loops can be very, very much part of that. Yeah.
I was actually even referring, I mean, I thank you
Yeah.
for that, but it's also even in terms of how they're defined within that society,
Yeah.
right? Even the diagnosis.
Oh, yes, that's entirely true. Yeah, I mean, as a psychologist, all of our phenotypes are to some extent, I would say, arbitrary but meaningful, right? Like we're describing things that matter in the population in the sense that they're relevant for functioning, but our definitions of intelligent behavior or schizophrenic behavior are necessarily somewhat socially arbitrary. Yeah. Yeah.
So to the last point, like in the literature, is there a suggested directionality where the genotype over generations ends up shaping environments, or is the other way around, environments shape the genotype, or it's still a question?
I mean, y'all are welcome to dive in here. So both, but I think they're happening on different time scales. So gene frequencies are certainly responding to environmental selection pressures, but that's going to be something that's happening over deeper time scales generationally, whereas the environment's ability to adapt to genetic differences within a population right now can happen very, very rapidly. So I think both of these things are happening. I think typically human behavioral genetics tends to focus on how genotypes shape environments, and human population genetics focuses more on how environments shape long-term population trends and gene frequencies. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if there's anything you would add to that or correct that. Okay. Okay, so as the result, this is what Eric Turkheimer and I wrote in a chapter we wrote a couple years ago, which is there's been thousands of twin studies. There's a really rich history of theoretical writing on these, and yet quantitative genetics remains stubbornly controversial, both widely accepted as foundational, yet regularly rejected as misleading or worse. And I think one example of this we both accept and reject as a broader field, the paradigm of behavior genetics, can be seen in something like schizophrenia, which is the example you broke up. So Irv Gottesman, who was one of the sort of founders of this field, his work in looking at twin correlations in schizophrenia and the transmission of schizophrenia from parent to child in Danish population registers was incredibly influential in the field of clinical psychology, moving away from these like refrigerator mom theories of what caused schizophrenia, right? Like we don't think of schizophrenia as a response to cold, harsh parenting anymore. We think of it as a genetic disease. We think of it as a brain disease. That is a completely foundational idea in psychology. It was based almost entirely on the results of behavior genetics. And so you will find tons of people in psychology that would not accept twin studies as a legitimate scientific tool, but would never ever say that schizophrenia is the result of refrigerator moms. So we have this kind of push-pull in which we accept some of the results, but still exist in this uneasy tension with the methods. This was made apparent to me when I was on the job market 10 years ago. I was at, I will not name the university. Someone asked me, well, will you be the last behavior geneticist? Because we can measure the genome now, and what people are doing with this serotonin transporter gene is just so much more interesting than anything you can do with a twin study. And I really feel vindicated, like in retrospect, for sticking with the more family-oriented paradigms. So I think psychology existed in this sort of uneasy truce with behavior genetics. Like we were like the redheaded stepchild of the field. The larger field was fine to accept some of our findings and some of our theories when it suited them, but I'm not sure how comfortable we are with twin studies. And then technology improved, and there was this ability to directly measure the human genome. And psychology was incredibly quick to embrace that as a method, but just one gene at a time. So these candidate gene focused studies. They were quick to adopt it. They were slow to abandon it. And they've been, I think, a little bit gun shy from the experience, and they have been accordingly very slow to readopt molecular genetic methods in the form of GWAS data or polygenic scores. So it was kind of like this over-enthusiastic embrace, and then this, I don't know if we're going to go there again. And I would say that that's really where genetics exists within the larger field of psychology right now. To some extent, that's frustrating, but to some extent, I think that's exciting, because I think there's a lot of opportunities here for methodological and theoretical synthesis. So we have this really rich history of behavior genetic writings in psychology. We have a whole suite of new tools that have largely not been embraced by the field, and bringing those things together, I think, offers some really exciting research opportunities. There's no clock in here. How am I on time?
You have 15 minutes.
Okay, all right.
You take a little more. You started a little late.
Okay. So, okay, so I'm going to try to give an example of trying to bridge the twin methods and the newer molecular genetic methods to address a question of psychological interest, and in particular, a question about non-cognitive skills. So non-cognitive skills in psychology are really a constellation of things that individual psychologists have come up with as a sort of like psychological flavor of the month. So things like growth mindset or grit, and they've been really hailed as, especially in the pop culture, as ingredients for success in academia that are in, not just in academia, but like in academic life, but in the job market and beyond, that aren't IQ, right? In the economics literature, they're less likely to talk about specific self-report methods like grit or mindset, but more likely to just say, essentially define non-cognitive skills by what they're not, right? So it is attainments that aren't predicted by IQ, or attainments that respond to some sort of intervention where the intervention effect doesn't seem to flow through gains in IQ. So non-cognitive skills is people are doing better for reasons that don't seem to be IQ, and we're gonna, Heckman in this article calls them motivation, perseverance, and tenacity, but he's not attempting to measure motivation, perseverance, and tenacity. He's just sort of saying, well, there's stuff there. I think it's motivation, perseverance, and tenacity. The problem with this, well, I think there's lots of problems with this literature, but one of the problems of this literature is there's been this like explosion of different methods. And this was a critical review that just came out in Nature Human Behavior that said, if you look at the correlation between any one of these measures of non-cognitive skill and attainments, they're really low, in part because the measures seem really shitty, like they're unreliable, and like, people's scores on them bounce all over the place. That same group looked at their SNP heritability, which we'll table what that is as a concept for a while, in a data set of children, and they were also like, most of these aren't even heritable. Like, how is this picking up on signal that matters for attainment if these aren't reliable or heritable skills?
I thought everything was heritable.
Well, okay, everything is heritable if the measurement is halfway reliable, right? But if it's just measurement error that you're picking up on, if it's just, I was really grumpy on this day that I got this Mechanical Turk survey to fill out, then that is less likely to be heritable. And in fact, what they found is that their rates of non-response on non-cognitive skills surveys were more heritable than the scores on the non-cognitive skills surveys, which is a sign of a serious measurement problem, right? So we have this idea that there's variance in attainments that are not IQ. We see that in GWAS data, that there's genetic variance in educational attainment that is independent of cognitive ability. We have a proliferation of psychological measures that allege to measure some aspect of non-cognitive skill. They don't agree with one another very well. They're not very reliable, and they're not very heritable. So how do we make progress with this particular problem? So our group has been tracking this from two different angles. So one is starting with those existing psychological measures of non-cognitive skills, using some psychometric methods to try to build a better measurement model of them. Can we extract some reliable measurement variance from them? And then porting them into a twin design to test which of these account for genetic variance in academic achievement. Okay, so this is really kind of, I think, from the ground up, or a theory-driven approach to understanding what non-cognitive skills are. The second approach we've been working with is more of a top-down approach, beginning with, well, the original economic conception of non-cognitive skills was variance and attainment separate from cognitive ability. So can we identify SNPs associated with non-cognitive variance and educational attainment? Can we then use those to construct polygenic scores? And then can we port those polygenic scores into new data sets and say, well, what do they predict, right? So these genetic variants that are associated with non-cognitive variance and educational attainment, what measures in my data do they correlate with? So the twin data comes from a twin project that I co-direct in Texas. It's about 2,000 kids that are recruited from Central Austin school registers. And we measure a lot about the cognition of these children. So they do a standardized reading and mathematics test in the lab. We give them a full-scale intelligence test. We give them a bunch of measures of executive functions, which is this ability to selectively regulate your attention and switch it back and forth. We give them 12 different tasks of that. Okay, so your first twin results, I think, of the workshop. So as David was mentioning, there's lots of different ways to estimate heritability. What we're doing here is we are saying, okay, we have 12 different measures of executive function. We are going to organize those as reflections of a higher order latent factor. One way you can think of this is it's kind of like a first principal component of performance on the 12 tasks. That's a rough analogy, but for right now it'll work. And then we are estimating the heritability of this common factor. There's lots of different ways to estimate the heritability of things. In this case, the model is actually very easy to fit because at the general factor level, identical twins are nearly perfectly correlated for their performance on executive functioning tasks. And there's essentially no non-additive genetic variance in general executive functioning. Thinking about, does that mean the environment doesn't matter? No. And one reason that the environment might matter is because we can't detect variation due to environmental things that all of the kids in our sample have in common. So a colleague of mine does work on executive functioning in unschooled children. So she goes to remote hunter-gatherer tribes and gives them variants of these tasks, but they haven't been to school. And what you see is huge exposure to schooling effects on these sorts of attention regulation tasks. Our kids are recruited from public school districts in Austin, right? So in the sense that they all have exposure to schooling, which is a massive intervention that we put kids through every day for years of their life, they don't vary in that. So it's not that the environment isn't making a difference for their executive function. It's that amongst public school children in Texas, the environments that they are experiencing aren't accounting for variation in their ability to regulate attention. Okay. All right. The other thing that we measured was, well, let's not just measure one non-cognitive skill. Let's measure a lot of them. Grit, need for cognition, intellectual self-concept. We'll have the RAs rate how motivated the kids are in the lab. We'll ask them how much they value their education. We'll ask them, moms, how far do you think these kids are going to go to school? And we're going to give them some standard personality inventories. And what we, again, this is measurement models. What we're trying to do is say, what reliable signal can we pull out from these measures? How do they cohere together into something that filters out some of the noise? And what we see is that they converge on two higher order factors, one of which is more about curiosity, motivation, intellectual interest, and the other about conscientiousness, perseverance. Okay. What?
This is these are the results of what kind of came up significant from a lot of other tests.
So these are all the tests that we administered, and then we are estimating a measurement model, a factor model here. So these are the statistical estimates there. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to dive into the details of latent factor modeling. Essentially what we're doing here is, can the pattern of covariance amongst these 9 measured things be more parsimoniously represented in the function of 2 higher order dimensions, which we are labeling openness and conscientiousness sort of based on what tasks these are tapping. Okay? So one is about how organized, dutiful people are, and one is about how interested and curious they are. Okay. All right. So a multivariate twin model is essentially saying, okay, well, we have genetic variance in achievement, we have genetic variance in IQ and executive function, we have genetic variance in these non-cognitive skills. Can we account for any of the heritable variation in achievement with heritable variation in other things we've measured? These are results for reading. And basically what I want you to focus on is, if we're talking about genetic variance in children's reading skills as estimated in a twin model, the biggest non-cognitive contributor to it is this openness superfactor, which is sort of curiosity and motivation. All right, so we've started with psychological measures, we've distilled them down into more reliable measures, and then we've ported them into a twin study and asked which of these account for heritable variation and achievement, and our answer is things related to openness-ish, okay? All right, the other option is to begin with GWAS data, right? So begin with these guys, GWAS of cognitive performance and educational attainment, do an analysis called Genomics Sim to try to identify what are the SNPs that are associated with the residual variation in educational attainment that's not cognitive performance, right? What's the non-cognitive SNPs? Use the results of that GWAS to score a new group of people's DNA. So it's a summary index of their genetic predisposition for non-cognitive skills that we got from the GWAS data. We're reporting that into 6 data sets from around the world. And we're asking, I'm going to skip forward a little bit, what do those polygenic scores predict in those data sets? These are big 5 personality characteristics. The black bars are meta-analytic estimates. And what we see, which I was delighted at, is that the genetic variants that were found to be associated with non-cognitive variance in educational attainment in the GWAS, when you put them into a new data set, the big 5 personality trait they predict the most is openness. So we're getting converging evidence from 2 lines of data on the importance of these openness characteristics as a core non-cognitive trait. Okay, so I'm interested in non-cognitive skills, but these are sorts of approaches that you could use for lots of different questions, right? So we have this latent A in a twin model and we don't know what it is, but can we build a model in which we try to decompose that into subcomponents? Or we're beginning with GWAS data and then we're trying to follow up. What do those genes predict? What are those genes, we call this phenotypic annotation. What are these genes related to that we care about in more richly phenotyped data sets that we have access to? Okay. Greg Duncan gives this talk about forget about the marshmallows. And I feel like this is my version of forget about the marshmallows. Like everyone thinks it's about self-control. And no, it's about curiosity and motivation. But that's a separate question. All right. I planned too many slides because I had too long of a plane ride this morning. Okay, so I'm gonna end with this one, which is thinking about zooming back out from the specific problem and thinking more broadly about how can genetics help psychology, and I think many of these questions apply to other sciences too, which is that I think psychology, many of our questions come down to what are the differences between people, right? Like we describe differences between people in terms of this person has schizophrenia and this person has bipolar disorder. But when we look at their genotypes, does the genetic etiology of those disorders map onto the phenotypic descriptions that we've come up with? Why are people different? We have a theory that refrigerator moms cause children to be schizophrenic. But then we look and we see that children who have biological mothers who were schizophrenic but were raised in a different family are still ending up with schizophrenia with the same rate. So our theory of like the refrigerator mom parenting starts to look less plausible. Yeah, question.
What's a refrigerator mom?
A refrigerator mom is, well, what does it sound like? What would you guess a refrigerator mom is? Okay, all moms dispense water. They're like, that's what mothers do, is they like, I need milk or I need water. Like, I'm basically a shorter to cook for my children. No, what is anyone guesses? Yeah. Yes, parents that are very cold and emotionally unresponsive. Right, exactly. See, this is the success of behavior genetics. None of you know what a refrigerator mom is. If this were 1954, you would know, because that was our predominant theory of why people had mental illness at that time. When in lifespan do differences emerge and stabilize? So if someone is showing a problem at age 6, does this presage a lifelong problem, or is this a developmental blip in their life? And who is going to benefit from our policy or intervention? All of these questions are things in which genetic data can be relevant in some way. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now.